Cloud. Okay, welcome to Open Canvas Working Group meeting number 3. For those of you who are watching the recording, just a reminder, this is a group of enthusiasts and Canvas makers, Canvas users, and that kind of stuff that are working towards an interoperable format that would ideally allow different canvases to interoperate, spanning from, as we talked about last time in meeting number 2, this spectrum of visual canvases, which you might think of like a Miro or a TL draw or an Excalidraw, where the primary information is encoded in terms of the visual fidelity, all the way to structural canvases, where the main thing that's encoded is the relationships between nodes. And those tools, yeah, so we're looking for something that kind of spans the middle ground. I dropped an image in the chat that kind of represents that Orion and I were thinking about last time. Orion actually drew this image. There's a link to where it's from. It's from the recap of meeting number 2, which you can find on GitHub. Probably the best place to engage beyond the Discord would be the GitHub repo, github.com/OCWG. There's a discussions repo in there where we encourage people, as they're thinking through any of these aspects, to please create and respond to discussions, because that helps us move beyond the ephemeral, closed nature of chat and the high bandwidth but low searchability of things like this meeting, and capture it into a document that we can respond to. So that's kind of quick overview. In terms of agenda for this week, Orion and I were syncing just before this, and we don't have a last week we had like a bunch of things to get through. There's not as much activity on the discussions in the last 2 weeks, so there's a couple things we could potentially work on today. The sort of the major effort right now is around getting to basically what we're, like, in quotation marks, calling JSON Canvas 2.0. So JSON Canvas, Obsidian, if you've seen their format, that sort of them publishing that was sort of the inspiration for this group of what if we could start with the JSON Canvas format, or start with something that looks like it, something that's file-based, something that's fairly minimal, and then we could extend that so that it supports a broader range of different canvas types, going beyond what, because the JSON Canvas spec is really very focused around Obsidian's very limited sort of functionality within their canvas, and it's like fit to purpose to their tool. Could we expand that so that it worked, so that we have a format that's general across a broader range of tools? What we've been thinking about for JSON Canvas 2.0 is a couple of major changes that we discussed last time. And so one thing we could do today, thank you, Dragan, for posting that link in the chat. What we could do today is talk about some of the specific changes that we think might go into a JSON Canvas 2.0, and how we would make that extensible, that kind of thing. And then if there are topics that you guys have that you'd like to talk about, we could also go from there. So that's our tentative agenda for the day. Orion, have you made it back to a computer spot? I know you were looking for a spot to be able to sit and open a laptop.
I haven't quite yet. I should be in about 10 minutes. I'm just waiting to be able to drop off my very oversized bag in the airport here.
Gotcha. No problem. Sounds good. Well, in that case, Orion had a little, he and I talked last week about a tentative JSON Canvas 2.0 spec, a tentative, like, minimal spec. And we were talking about how we might handle versions and make it extensible. So I'm going to give Orion like 10 minutes to see if he can maybe share his screen. If not, I can share mine and go on. So, like, we'll flip the agenda, and I'll instead see if anybody's coming with specific questions or concerns or things that they've read on through the discussions that they want to talk through. And then we'll go to kind of talking about the minimal spec second, if that works for you guys. So this is the part where if you guys have questions, concerns, thoughts, you can jump in.
Off the top of my head, one thing that I'm really curious about, to see whether we're going to be able to find a solution for that, is how do we make actually products and canvases which are very different in terms of provided capabilities, with ways to kind of fall back to other objects or other parts which can be consumed in other products, in other parts, like in all of the products that will support this file format. I can imagine, for example, like having very complex objects or widgets coming from the Miro space that has lots of plugins, applications, you name it. How will we be able to find a common ground in order to make a version of the same object in more minimalistic products, so that important content and important information is still provided some way without being lost completely?
Yeah, I think there's two things. Go ahead, Max. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have two views on this. One is you can do it like an email where you have like the HTML email and a fallback plain text content. We could do something like that. Or in general, we could say these embedded items on the canvas, they are like files. Files have a file type, and different apps can render different file types. So do you have some kind of app and it recognize, this is just an image, some SVG-ish thing, I can render it. This is a Miro special application, I have no clue. I cannot render it. I just render a blue box or maybe the fallback content or nothing. It depends, but there are different kinds of content and different capabilities in the apps. That's maybe the reality.
Yeah.
I think in many ways, like this is the crux of the problem we're trying to solve, is how do we make, because it solves it from two directions. How do you handle diverse feature sets? So we're going to have non-overlapping features across all of these different things. What in general is the solution strategy here? So Max mentioned, potentially having, for every time you define an object, you have the opportunity to define some fallback as well. That is sort of the fallback category is defined by the spec, right? So it can be understood that every canvas that supports the spec knows how to like render a fallback container or something like that. It's basically, a broken image or whatever. And so then you can, when you're embedding objects, you can always you can optionally embed a fallback container so that it shows up on other canvases. If you don't embed one and it doesn't understand it, it's just going to leave it off. So it becomes the responsibility of the tool to kind of pepper it with these, to augment all of the objects with these fallback containers. And I'm taking some liberty with your first idea, Max, but I think the second idea, though your reference to email, the second idea is more around like MIME types. And then you can think of every object as having a type that is associated with it. And then canvases can then support or not support specific types. And then the fallback now is on the canvas, right? The fallback is looking at the spec, the canvas that's loading the file is looking at the objects and saying, I support that one, but I don't support that version, so I don't even know that version, and so I'm not going to try and load that because that might crash, because I don't know that version of that file type, and then and that kind of thing, and then it can take responsibility for how to handle falling back, right? I think those are kind of two different ways to do it. Orion showed an example where that we were talking about last week with this sort of file type inversion. And so the idea would be that basically every node that's on the every object that's on the canvas would be required to have a file type inversion. And maybe some of these file types would be core, like provided by OCWG, and we would like all understand that this is a shape. And a shape has sides and that kind of stuff. And there's sort of a spec, core spec defined. But even that core spec of that shape object file type could be versioned as well, so that you can migrate forward and kind of extend the spec. And so this is the other piece. So handling diverse functionality is one piece, one framing of this problem. The other framing of this problem is extensibility. The thing that's really amazing about email is that it was defined before there was even a rich text email type, right? There was plain text email, and the email spec was written in such a way that you could eventually move to this rich text email format And email clients, if you guys have ever looked at the way that email works, right now it sends both the plain text version and the rich text version. Most clients do. And then in a plain text context can show that, and the rich text context can show that. So the viewer can then choose which one it can support. And so we're looking for something similar here, where we have this minimal format that you start with, but can be extended over time to use cases that we had not previously anticipated. Like unexpected use cases is where we would want the extensibility model to allow for in the long run. Max, I'll read your comment, and maybe you can extend it if you'd like. It says you can even mix both. Every item can have a content with a content type and possibly as fallbacks, a list of more content or content type pairs. It's kind of like a REST resource that has content negotiation all serialized in the object itself. I don't know if you want to extend.
That's how the web works. So you have like a browser fetching a resource saying, I can read these languages, these file types, send me something, and then you get something back. And that's what we can also do here for serialization. We just put like the 1 or 2 or 3 formats that are available in the file, and then the viewer decides, okay, do I want to see the SVG or the PNG or the Miro special built-in? Whatever I can. So it's all based on existing specs this way.
Mm-hmm.
REST resource exists, content negotiation exists, MIME types exist. So we can just reuse that all. And then a canvas is like a pre-composed view of resources.
And thinking about fallbacks, now that the conversation is going on, and also coming a little bit from the accessibility perspective, it would be nice probably to have in the fallback, if we decide to go like the way of providing fallback, having at least for every single object, I was thinking something along the lines of what the accessibility tree is for the web and for HTML and for the DOM. So being able to at least provide something very, very, like semantically speaking, very, very basic, like a name, a role, and I can't remember which are all of the properties right now, but there's about like 4 or 5, no more than that. That would at least allow even the dumbest of fallbacks to have some meaningful information about what was in the original content that can't be rendered by the specific canvas.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think one of the things I like about you mentioned file based interop, Stefano, earlier, is that ideally the file would be in a somewhat human readable format, we'll put it that way, of like a human reader could look at it and make sense of it, right? It's not binary, and it's not as obtuse as XML. But if you look at a Obsidian canvas, the JSON canvas format that Obsidian saves out right now, you can mostly make sense of it. And I've actually hand edited the text in a Obsidian canvas file on disk, and then had it reload in Obsidian canvas just to see what would happen. Of like, what happens if I change this property? And so I think one goal here is that the ultimate fallback is text, right? Of like this file is actually preserved as text, which someone could then take and this is more about data preservation than accessibility, Stefano. But yeah, you're right. There's if there's a generally understood shape to all objects, let's say they have a properties bag, they have a schema that's associated with them, you may not have the file type and know how to display the schema, then you could write basically a presenter that would be very boringly generic, but would present at least maybe the plain text properties of the from that object on the canvas in some way. So
makes sense.
Yeah. Let's see. Michael asks, when you have an infinite canvas, what would the starting point be for something like an accessibility tree?
Yeah, I've been.
Well, the canvas itself.
Yeah,
the board.
Yeah, when I can imagine if you have a structured diagram which has a clear starting point, that is quite obvious that could be the starting point for an accessibility tree or a textual representation of of a canvas. But what if you have a lot of nodes that don't have connections or just small groups?
Well, I can answer to that because we posed ourselves the question already, and like in our case, it's a very flat tree, meaning that the root node is always the board, like the canvas itself. It acts as the main point, the main entry point for the accessibility tree. And then if the content is completely flat, so if you've got a bunch of objects just scattered across the board, well, it's a tree with as many branches as the objects and just one level. If you've got containers, then it gets deeper and deeper and has a structure. In terms of diagramming, the way we handle diagramming, we consider like every object is a first-class citizen. So connectors as well are part, like the information. It's like as Jess already told before, like Miro is mostly on the visual side of things and less on the structural side of things. So of course users can that have vision can identify and they can make sense of the visual representation of a diagram, but then the connector lines themselves they are no special entities. They are just objects as any other object into the space. And then there are relations between an object and another object, and that's where connectors can be bound to other parts. But like let's say that there are two overlapping structures. One is the accessibility tree of the objects on the board, where every object is one and the same, like they're all equal. There are no nodes and edges, and then you can overlay the diagramming structure on top.
But the
Yeah, I think
order
that
in
makes
the,
sense. Go ahead, Michael.
yeah, the order in the accessibility tree, would that be the if you've all loose nodes, would that be depending on the place where they are, sorted by X and Y position, for example, or sorted by the moment when you place it on the canvas?
They are sorted by the order of insertion, and then at navigation time, we try and find a reading order sort. So it's actually the visit, like the visiting has the smart logic inside, whereas the data structure is completely flat. It's just a list of things.
Right, unless
It's
there are
pretty
connectors, right?
similar.
Like,
Yeah, it's pretty similar to JSON canvas. Like here we have two categories, nodes and edges. We have only nodes, and that's it. And then it's
you
up
have
to the
nodes,
application.
but you know, Miro knows internally that this node type is really a connection, right? You
Yes.
guys just don't store it internally any differently. You store it in your data format. You just represent it as another node type.
Everything is an object, and then of course objects have different types, and objects also have the ability to assign dependencies to other objects.
Bingo.
And this is very useful to make the connections with diagrams. It also allows us to bulk insert and bulk delete things that are meant to be into the same container. Like it's not just like the dependencies are not just the parent-children relationships, because connectors are not really children of the nodes that they connect, because they have two entry points. So you don't want them to be children of one specific object. So every single object can define a list of downwards or upwards dependencies. So I didn't want to do that, sorry. And so you can basically usually nodes define connectors as downward dependencies. So if you delete the node, then you delete the connectors as well. And on the opposite side, the connectors list the nodes as upward dependencies.
Interesting.
So it's sort
Dragon
of
asks,
it's sort of an extended version of parent-children relationships where any single node can have not only multiple children, but also can have, so to speak, multiple parents. They're not really parents, but things that are bound to them.
right, references, and
References, upward
yeah.
and downward references. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But you distinguish between upward and downward internally.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay, cool.
So
Yeah, I think the generalization of that idea would be just a flat map with references, general references between objects, where the references between objects could have properties on them. And in your case, that property is an I don't know if you think of up or down as like an outgoing or an incoming edge. I don't know how you like. If I want to go into Miro and like draw an arrow between two boxes and then have you tell me what actually is happening under the covers. But my point is the relationships or the references between objects can have types.
Yep.
Yeah, this is something that has been quite a big focus in breadcrumbs recently. In the previous version, the semantics of direction were forced on the user. You told breadcrumbs which fields you use, which edge types you add, parent, child, sibling, and you were forced to put those under one of the 5 directions. But based on a suggestion from Lemons, there are just edge types now. They have no inherent semantics, but the user is able to define those same relations using a rule of transitive closures across paths of edges. And that's perhaps stepping away from the point of this, but it's very useful to not enforce any semantic on the edge type.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's starting to occur to me that like the types on edges or the types on relations or references, whatever we're going to call them, between objects is going to become another, as they call, centralizing point when you think about interoperability, right? If Miro is saving out, they have a type on the edge, which is up or down, then a program that's reading a file that was saved out by Miro and would need to know what it means by that, right? And I'm wondering if like relations themselves need a schema. I had been thinking about objects having a type name and a version. I had not been thinking about the properties on the edges themselves having a relationship having a type and a schema, but now it seems kind of obvious. Like, of course, you would want a schema there as well.
Yeah.
Here's a concrete example. If a canvas doesn't support edge types, right? It just supports relationships between objects. Say Canopio, for example. I don't think they actually have edge types. They just have, you can connect different nodes. So it's a much simpler interface. If they're opening a Miro file through this, then they would see that these two objects are related with an edge, one with an up, one with a down, and they would just ignore that. They would say like, well, all we care about is that these two objects are related, and so we'll draw a relationship between those two things and represent that in Canopio. But in terms of the schema, we just don't know what up or down means, and we don't care because our application doesn't support that difference. And so it can safely ignore that type name and not try to present it in any way.
That makes sense. But yeah, having a schema for relations as well would be very useful. A very powerful use case that I've come across recently. Are you familiar with Monica, the personal relationship manager? It's like a CRM for human relationships. Very cool stuff, but it's quite closed off. And a feature that it's been missing for a while is the ability to automatically infer more complex relationships based on the simpler ones. For example, your parent's sibling is your sibling-in-law. It doesn't have that ability. And using this system of transitive chains of edges, you can create completely customizable implied relationships. It's really quite powerful and relatively simple as well.
Very cool. I found a reference for Monica. Any other questions, thoughts from? I tried to link in the chat, by the way, to discussions that have already happened on GitHub that touch on some of these topics. So if you're interested in writing down some of your thoughts, reading what other folks that have been on these calls have thought about these same things, there's links in the chat to some discussions posts that have more information. Go ahead, Ross. I think you were going to say something.
It's back on the idea of fallbacks and deciding who's responsible for handling a node. I left a comment about like dog fooding, how you can like OpenCanvas could develop an API that it not only gives out to users to implement node handlers, but it uses itself so that the format between node handlers is consistent for fallbacks and for plugin node handlers. And then you can decide what the default node handler is, what the fallbacks are as like a sane preference. But a user, someone implementing a canvas, could just swap that stack of node handlers as they need.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that concept. So I think what you're saying is that like there would be no sort of default object types. Everything would be an extension, so to speak. And then
extensions are a good way.
Whatever we might call them, you know, schema, extension, type, I'm not sure, object, I don't know, I'll have to come up with the term here, but I think there aren't any default object types or object extent. Every object type is provided via an extension. Now, some of those extensions might be maintained and distributed under the core OCWG namespace, but that's just an implementation detail of like where that is distributed by. And then the OCWG internal, sort of even those core extensions would have the fallback support. And
that's interesting. I was making a distinction between the object types, like how we're representing it in the saved file, for example, versus the node handler, the thing that renders the markdown node on the canvas, for example. So like I think OpenCanvas should have more of a say in the object schema, because that's like a working group kind of thing to decide. But then the node handlers, these renderers, are just like plugins, extensions that you give an order of preference to.
I think I understand what you're saying. So you're basically saying separate the view from the schema layer, and that you could distribute a renderer that knows how to render a specific type, and maybe it's implemented as like a web component or like a React functional component so that it can be integrated into specific application use cases.
Yes, like you might have a markdown node which just points to a file path, but like the GitHub markdown renderer might present it differently from Obsidian's. And so more the point of what I was focusing on is that the implementation, like the plugin system, is some OpenCanvas API that you expose, but for the node handlers that you as the working group decide to implement, use the same system so that they're all interoperable.
Yes, I think that has a lot of advantages. It makes sense. Yeah, and Orion, I noticed Max's comment here that just an observation that we're seeming to discuss three different kinds of structure right now. One is this core structure, which is, if I understood that for Max for you to mean the sort of minimal structure through which you can define items and relations. Like having, for example, items having a type name and a version would be part of the core structure. And then there would be items and relations are the two sort of kinds of things that can be represented. And yeah, and then items and relations, what's the structure of each one of those? Do they also have type names, versions? Yeah, I think another interesting wrinkle here is how to distribute the schemas, like how to represent and distribute the schemas for these. And forgive me, I'm switching back and forth between the word type and schema. For an item type, like for example, if Miro who has a much more robust set of things that you can represent on the canvas, if they wanted to export a open canvas file and encode some of the nodes that likely other canvases aren't going to be able to represent or have a plugin for, or have a renderable way to render it at all, they might actually publish their schemas for those objects under some Miro namespace, right? Like Miro slash this particular thing, and then you can look that up to know what the properties are, what the properties mean effectively, what the properties are and what they mean for that particular node type. And where is that schema distributed? Like, is it written into the file itself as in like a schema block, or is it accessible through some service like npm? That kind of thing is another interesting. Orion says, I have thoughts almost through security. I was hoping to trigger you by saying that, Orion. This gets to some of the stuff he was talking about last week. Just for the sake of the recording, for folks who are listening along at home, Dragon says, yes, I use a syntax like parent, comma, sibling, points to a sibling in law. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm replying to Dragon there.
Cool.
Yeah, Dragon asked about transitive references. Sorry for interrupting you.
No worries. No, that's okay. Did you want to? I'm aware of the fact that people who are listening to the recording won't be able to see the chat, and so when I'm referencing someone in the chat, I try to read their comment and then respond to it. Did you have something you wanted to respond, or are you going to just respond via chat?
It's more pointing out that that wasn't Dragon's message. I was responding to Dragon.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sure.
Ross responding to how the transitive stuff is happening. Oh, I see. Yeah.
Perhaps the chat transcript can be exported and sent along with the recording.
Yeah, it will be available on GitHub. I think one of the things that's frustrating is the just accessibility of presenting both the video and the chat in synced alongside each other. If you do something like this through YouTube live stream, you get that functionality for free. If you do anything other than that, there is no tool for displaying those two things and keeping them in sync, which is ludicrous, but that's the state of online meetings. All right, so I'm gonna fill a few more minutes with until Orion gets through security and he can kind of share some of the stuff he was talking about. And what I'll do is kind of wrap up the meeting and talk about next steps, and then let Orion fill up to the point. Just looking that we have about 16 minutes left. Kind of where we're at the big picture of the project is I have been following a thing called the Manifesto for Rules for Standard Makers, which is this post from Dave Weiner, who was instrumental in RSS podcasting, several other standards before that, XML standards. So he's kind of infamous for writing standards that people actually use and scale. And one of the points he makes in that post is the only thing that really matters for interop is actual pieces of software interoping with each other. Formats or protocols or specs don't actually matter. And the point he's making is get real tools interoperating with each other as fast as possible. And that is what drives real world interoperability. Otherwise, you're just talking. And to avoid spending our time just talking, we want to get tools that are working together as quickly as possible. We had several folks who are interested in this, both from the TL Draw team and the Excalidraw team. And those canvases have the enviable quality of possessing a very similar feature set. So the overlap between those two canvases is very high. They're also open source. And so someone from not the core team could extend those, could provide an export or an import for a minimal feature set. So something that Orion has been working on has been a minimal interop between Excalidraw and TLDraw. And we're just targeting those two canvases because we've had people participating from them and they have fairly large established user bases. And so if Miro were interested in working on a minimal interop, obviously you guys also have a fairly large established user base. And so that's the way that I'm looking at this as an effort is we need to get real tools that have real users doing real interop ASAP. And lest we spend all of our time optimizing. Now, you want to make some good decisions around those initial, kind of feet you put forward. But there's a sense in which it almost doesn't matter if you get real tools actually working with interop from the beginning. Like you're going to be wrong, and you're going to like paint yourself into corners. But try to get real tools using this as quickly as possible. So that's something that we're actively working on. We'll hopefully to have something to show 2 weeks from now. And I'm going to kind of help Orion with some of those steps. And then I think the next there's work from a concrete instantiation, which is like Excalidraw, TLDraw interop, and then the other piece would be writing a minimal spec and then getting feedback on that. So there's been now 2 weeks, last week and this week, we've had conversations around this sort of 2.0 spec. I think my action item between now and 2 weeks from now is to have something written that people can look at that basically encapsulates the ideas that we've discussed so far, things around type name inversion, things around separating references or relations from items, that, providing the basic core, moving properties into a properties bag. Like all of these things are things that we've discussed and have been in discussions in GitHub, but we don't have a singular document to poke at and say, this is wrong, this is right. And so I'll look at getting that spec up and running while Orion works on sort of the TLDraw, Excalidraw interop piece. Does anybody else have anything that they would like to commit to doing between now and 2 weeks from now? Not required, but if you did, I would basically write it in the notes as something that way other people know you're working on it. And if they want to ask questions or they want to help, they know who to go talk to.
Is there a list of things that need doing already?
I think the two that I mentioned seem like the highest priority of like make interop work between specific tools would be one of those things. And that doesn't have to be, and that can be any tool to tool interop for now because we'll learn with each one of those that we do.
I'll have it done by next week.
Which tools?
All of them.
Joe, all of them. Yes. You're going to solve the n squared problem. AI is going to help you, I'm sure.
Perhaps like a list of like very concrete, I can commit to getting this done by next week, like issues on a repo kind of thing.
Yeah.
That would be valuable.
Yeah, I think the other one that's helpful, I mentioned this, Stefano, in the chat. We do have a spreadsheet that has basically a column for all these different tools, and it specifies a bunch of everything from very high level thing, like what language is this implemented in, to very low level things like what is the assumed XY start position, the XY coordinate, and like what are the coordinate directions. Like these turn out to be really important things when you get into the details of stuff. So adding a column for a tool that you're working with, whether it's Breadcrumbs or Miro. I mean, Breadcrumbs, it's a little bit different because you're working with a conceptual and as opposed to a visual, and a lot of the things are visual there. But take a look at that and adding a row there could be something that could be helpful.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm trying to compile the Miro one to the best of my abilities. And another thing that I could do in the next couple of weeks, well, myself, I unfortunately can't do very, very much, but at least I can get in touch with the integrations and import-export team, like the team that owns importing and exporting, and at least make them aware of the initiatives if they're not already.
Great.
And then to actually make something interoperable with Miro, either we convince them that it's something valuable, so to speak, like it's an initiative that's worth accomplishing. But probably even easier would be to wait for the next hackathon. So we do organize hackathons twice a year or 3 times a year, like every now and then. Unfortunately, the last one was like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. So it's gonna be, I wouldn't say a very, very long time, but a pretty long time until the next one happens. But if the moment the next hackathon happens, this could be a very, very nice hackathon project that I could take myself, or somebody else could if they're interested into the thing.
Yeah, that's awesome. These are both great.
I am out of security now. Sorry, I've been pretty quiet for this call.
Yeah, you sound fine, Orion. I can't hear any background noise.
All right, sweet. I meant quiet as in not chiming in all that much.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Yeah. No, that makes sense. In fact, Orion, it might be helpful just to do like a quick screencast video recording of what we talked about last time, like even like a 3 or 4 minute video might be helpful. And we can always post that to the Discord. Max, I'm glad you brought this up.
Happy to do that.
So Max asks for the tool makers, what about SVG as a format for data items which render to simple shapes? This was some context here. There's a discussion item in GitHub about how to represent freehand drawings. So there's TLDraw has this thing called Perfect Freehand that was built by Steve, who built TLDraw as well, where they it's really nice to write on a TLDraw canvas. That's one of the things that kind of makes it stand out. But some tools like Obsidian don't support any type of freehand support. Other tools like Miro, TLDraw, ExcaliDraw have full freehand sketching. And so a freehand object is something you would want to be able to optionally present and encode. And then the question came up, how to represent a freehand object. And I think one of the suggestions for that was SVG. I think Max is actually making a slightly larger suggestion here of saying being able to represent arbitrary shapes, not just freehand, but arbitrary shapes as SVG would allow us to leverage an existing format and not have to kind of reinvent the wheel in terms of, and we would have full arbitrary shape support at that point.
We don't even need to support all of SVG. We could even just define our subset of it, which is required. And basically, if you have circle, rectangle, and path text, then you have almost everything you need. And
if I'm not mistaken,
yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, everything is a path for us.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Because of the rendering, and like we render on the canvas, so the canvas has support for path 2D, which is very, very, very similar to the SVG definition of a path 2D. So almost everything that we need to draw in terms of shapes, almost everything is a path.
That's awesome. I think it's a great idea for it strikes me, Max, as a specific example of a type that we could support natively that would actually leverage another renderer, another ecosystem entirely, which feels really good. It's kind of like, it would be the same way if we think about text nodes, where we would say that this text node has a type markdown, right?
Yes.
A type of markdown. It's like, great, we're leveraging the entire markdown ecosystem for that that text format. Not all text has to be markdown, but when you do, you get the entire markdown ecosystem along with it. And SVG feels like a smart one to pull in. Actually, the author of the SVG spec works at the W3C. I'm trying to remember his name. He was actually recommended to me as someone that we should get involved with this effort and who would be interested in helping out with the effort generally. So I'll have to reach back out to him. I guess he's had a little bit of experience formalizing specifications. I think he had also worked on several other things that I had heard of other than SVG. I'm trying to remember what they were, but yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things about canvases generally is that usually what you're trying to do with canvases is put things on them. And those things are usually multimedia of some other media type. They're other than sort of the edges between objects on the canvas, which those feel native to the canvas medium has nodes and edges, and that's the native thing. But what the nodes are is almost always another medium that's being placed on the canvas. In some ways, like a canvas is a meta medium. It's a medium that shows the relationships between other media and allows you to visualize them in some way.
I'd be happy to try taking some subset of SVG and including that in the experiments with the Excel draw, TL draw interop. Because as far as I know, both of those should be able to render, SVG paths and stuff. The one thing I will say on that, which we have talked about before, is that as a representation of like kind of semantically rich information, SVG as a format has some challenges because it's mostly concerned with kind of a series of operations that result in some very specific, very precise visual at the end of it. But if you, for example, even something as kind of mundane as like robustly getting hit detection for the insides of shapes, or like representing that some text is of a certain type, like that kind of stuff isn't really native to that as a format. But as a kind of interoperable standards based rendering solution for a subset of things that people do want to put on the canvas, I think that could be an interesting thing to look at, supporting SVG path or SVG string data really in the somewhere in the spec.
Yeah, that's good. Cool. Well, we've got about 2 minutes to wrap up. Orion, did you have anything else you wanted to throw in? I know you've been going through airport security, so I imagine that you'll need to catch up on the recording. But anything else before we wrap up?
Yeah, good question. The timing ended up being very poor because my flight was delayed, which meant I was going through the airport at exactly the time that I didn't want to. I think I'll just reiterate a point that kind of came up earlier. I definitely have lots of more specific points about the things that people have said, which I'll try and put in GitHub. But there were some points raised around like how we do the next steps and the impact that has on the trajectory of this as a project. And so I think having good answers to those questions is really important, where we really want to make sure that momentum is maintained and kind of make sure that we're treating this not as a kind of an interest group, which it is as well, right? We're all here because we're interested in this stuff. But really making sure that we're driving that towards results in the not too distant future. I think we said in the first call, shooting for something like like a 6-month-ish time frame to have several tools implementing at least a kind of a prototype of the spec that we end up with would be a good thing to shoot for. And anything that we have that's gonna kind of help drive momentum forward, I think is important, because of course we're all doing this with our free time and limited resources. So at least for my part, I'm very happy to drive forward the TL draw, Scala draw, interop experiments. I'd also be happy to pick up more of those if other people have tools, especially ones that they have deep knowledge of that I can ask questions to. That massively reduces the burden of work on me. And if you don't have time to do that work, I'm happy to pick up that interoperability demo challenge.
Yeah, I think one of the ones that would be one of the ones we haven't discussed much yet, Orion, is an interop between a tool that's very much on the structural side of thing, and like TL draw or Scala draw as the something that's on the other side of the spectrum. So whether that's property graphs, which have been mentioned several times, or GraphViz, or something that a more pure XY free structural representation, and then how would you map that? How would you map that to TL draw and then creating the two-way interop? I feel like that's another place where we need to try to span that spectrum as broadly as we can. And so we've got one interop that is like two tools that are almost in the same spot on the spectrum, and it would be good to like try and do one that's a little bit further away.
Yeah, that's a good example. One last thing that I wanted to chime in, which came up earlier, but I really like the idea of having as a suggested fallback mechanism for implementers of Canvas tools, that kind of per object text view. So in the cases where you don't have schema support for something, being able to see like, oh, okay, I don't actually know how to render this, but I can still show you the text of just this object. And maybe if you wanted to, then you could even edit that text and be like, oh, well, I know that this tool has an equivalent of what I'm looking for. Let me change the type name and delete these two fields that don't exist or something. You have that kind of escape hatch mechanism.
Cool. Yeah. Well, guys, we are 2 minutes past time. And so I'm going to go ahead and call it here. Stop the recording.